Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to the first Lantern Talk of 2022. The Women's Refugee Commission is excited to present today's session, which combines art and advocacy. We are thrilled today to have an extraordinary group of people join us. We have Jonas Poher Rasmussen, who is the director of the film Flee. The film was nominated for 3 Oscars and has received more than 40 awards, including the Sundance Film Festival's Grand Jury Prize for documentary. Flee tells the extraordinary true story of Amin, a former refugee from Afghanistan who, on the verge of marriage, feels compelled to share for the first time his deeply hidden and buried past. In addition, we have with us the Women Refugee Commission's Vice President of Advocacy and External Relations, Gayatri Patel. And we're also very pleased to have with us Bilal Askaryar. Bilal is a former refugee from Afghanistan. He's the head of communications at the Welcome with Dignity campaign, which is a national coalition of more than 90 organizations fighting tirelessly for the rights of people seeking asylum at the US border with Mexico. And he is a longtime partner and friend of the Women's Refugee Commission. We'd like to begin by taking a quick look at a clip from the film Flee.
Prøv en lille smule længere op. Meget lidt. Så hvis du ligesom lukker øjnene nu,
ja,
og prøver at trække vejret sådan dybt ind. Hvad betyder ordet hjem for dig?
Hjem er noget, som er trygt.
Kaboul, les attaques des Moudjahidines repris.
Har du nogensinde fortalt din livshistorie før?
Nej. Vi skal ud. Det er nu. Lidt dårligt samvittighed, at min bror han bliver tilbage. Vi flygtede med menneskesmuglerne. Det værste mennesker i mit liv.
Har du fortalt Kasper nogle af de her historier overhovedet?
Nej. Det tager tid at stole på folk. Det går rundt. Og tænk tilbage. Så det er min fortid, og det jeg kan ikke flygte fra det, og jeg har heller ikke lyst. Jeg kan mærke, at der skal ske noget. Her starter jo min historie.
And yes, I met Amin 25 years ago when I was 15 years old. I grew up in this small, rural Danish village. And one day, Amin showed up all by himself from Afghanistan, and he was 16. And he stayed in foster care with a family just around the corner from where I lived. And he learned Danish really fast. And soon we started to meet up at the bus stop every morning going to high school. And we became very good friends. And already back then, I, of course, was curious about how and why he had come, but he didn't want to talk about it. And I, of course, respected that. But this story, his past, kind of became this black box in our friendship and also within him, and something that he couldn't really crack open. And he kept it a secret for all these years. And then 15 years ago, I asked him if he could do a radio documentary about his story. I have a background in radio. And he then said that he still didn't feel quite ready but he knew that he would have to share his story at some point because he felt this disconnect in his life. He couldn't make his past and his present connect, and he really felt like he needed to do that because, keeping secrets, you tend to keep people at a certain distance because you're afraid of getting exposed. So he was struggling to generate close relationships, and he felt like, okay, but I need to connect my past and present, and I need to get the secret out there in order to be able to be honest to who I am. And he said when he was ready to share, he would like to share it with me, but he didn't feel quite ready back then yet. And then again, years passed, and I was invited for this workshop in Denmark called AniDocs, where they invite documentary filmmakers and animators to develop ideas for animated documentaries. And they asked me if I had an idea, and I thought, okay, but maybe this is a good way to tell the story. And I approached him about the idea, and he was really intrigued by the fact that he could be anonymous behind the animation, that he didn't have to be in the public eye with these stories, these very traumatic experiences he had, because what you hear in the film is the very first time he shares these stories, and it's very difficult for him to talk about these things. And he can do that to me because we've been friends for 25 years, but he's not able to small talk about it with people at work or in the supermarket or at a birthday party. So the fact that he could keep control and didn't have to be in the public eye because he could be anonymous behind the animation was really what enabled him to start opening up and sharing his story. And that's where the whole thing started. But it's been a long process. So I think in the beginning for him, just to kind of start opening up and start sharing the story was a big relief for him, because all of a sudden he could connect these things, connect the dots, and connect his past with his present, and he could start to open up about these experiences he had and talk about it when he felt like it. But then also having the experience to have the film made and have it out there and see that people could relate to his story was really, really important to him. I think being double marginalized, being both gay and a refugee, I think he was a little concerned that people wouldn't be able to relate. So to see the film travel across borders, across the world, and to see that people from all areas of society can relate to a story and take it in and get moved by it has been a very emotional experience for him.
We were the last ones to leave, and that was also, I think, very traumatic for the family to realize that no one was left in this country that they had lived in for literally 1,000 years, right? Like with them, everything that they had was gone. They took us before a judge who looked at the case and said, yeah, this makes sense. If you go back to Afghanistan, you'll be in serious danger. And so that judge, all the people in between, they're the reason why I'm here and alive, and they saved my parents' lives. Unfortunately, now it just seems like we're punishing people for asking us for safety. They're kept in detention, they're not given the permission to work or make any kind of money, and they don't have housing, they don't have anything. So they're in an impossible situation. Welcome with Dignity is a new campaign that was just launched this year by the people who advocate for and serve people seeking safety in the United States. We believe that everyone deserves a fair chance to ask for safety here, and that they should be treated with dignity along the way. I want to be able to make sure that today's families get that same chance that my family did, and that the little kids have that same chance to grow up and become whoever they imagine that they want to be. In many ways, I also share that quality of being double marginalized, being gay, and coming to the United States as a refugee. And so it just made it clear that, it shouldn't take so many exceptions and so many special miracles to, to be able to lead a normal, fulfilling life. And then I want to make sure that people have that same chance. Like I said in that video, I just want to say that when I first watched Flee, I was struck just how many similarities there were between Amin and I. There's a scene in the beginning of the film where Amin is in his sister's bedroom or his bedroom, and there's two posters above him of one, I think is Jean-Claude Van Damme and a pop star. And I had that experience in Kabul as a little kid. I would go to my cousin's house, and she had a picture of Madonna and a picture of George Michael, two posters, and I think about that and I'm like, yeah, no wonder I turned out gay. but so all of those things like make it pretty clear for me that this is the right path for me. You can find moments of inspiration and joy often in this work. I think it's in just the fact that, often I'll come across a mom or a parent who just has gone through so much, so many unimaginable things like Amin's family did. And at the end of the day, they still believe in the goodness of other people and the chance to, and the goodness of these countries that are receiving them, to offer them a new chance. And so that is always inspiring.
Sure, Alex, and thank you so much. And again, thank you to Bilal and Jonas for your words. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Women's Refugee Commission, we are a research and advocacy organization whose mission it is to really stand up for and speak up for the rights of women, youth, children, and others affected by crisis and conflict. And our connection with Afghanistan has been longstanding because the crisis and conflict in Afghanistan itself has been longstanding. So, in the lead up to the Taliban's takeover in August, we had been monitoring the situation for quite a while, and we certainly were growing increasingly concerned, not just for the situation for Afghan women and girls, but also for others, such as those in the LGBTQ community, minority groups, people with disabilities, etc. And we know what the Taliban rule looked like in the past, and unfortunately had no indication that things would be any different if they took over. So our level of concern was already elevated even before August. But then in mid-August, as the Taliban closed in on Kabul, it really felt like some of our worst fears were coming true. One of the first calls I received on the morning of August 15th was from a colleague who very frantically was like, please call anyone you know in Congress to help get women out, because Kabul is going to fall today. And the most immediate concern that day was really getting those most at risk, getting the Afghan women politicians, Afghan women human rights defenders, the other prominent women who had been speaking up for women's rights and girls' rights and LGBTQ rights, et cetera, out of the country if they so chose. And the process of that was so fraught. I mean, they had to get to the airport. They had to have all of their documents. They had to be on a list to be able to even enter the airport. We all saw the scenes of what things were looking like at the airport that day. There was chaos, people desperate to get out of the country. So our role was really, working behind the scenes to identify those who are most at risk. And brutal retaliation from the Taliban was right around the corner for so many of them. Some were already hiding out in safe houses. Some were already reporting that Taliban soldiers had, been banging on their doors or showing up at their workplaces because of their past activism or their past roles, or even current roles in the government that the Taliban had just taken over. so the threat was very real, and the fear was very real. And our job was really to help. So the biggest challenges were, getting documents. A lot of people who needed to leave urgently didn't have their passport or necessary other documents like identity documents. A lot of them were worried about leaving their families behind because only they were able to get onto a plane, but their families had to stay, and there was a really uncertain fate meeting them. There were concerns about getting safely to the airport. I remember one group of one woman and her family were close to the airport gate and were being shot at. And I'm still not clear who was shooting at them, but just, the process of getting to safety was so chaotic and desperate and dangerous. So our job was really to identify who these people most at risk were, and get those individuals on the radar of colleagues at the State Department, at the Department of Defense, Congress, et cetera, to get them on that list to help them get out of the country. And I have to say, within this first few weeks, we must have shared hundreds, if not thousands, of names of people who we were truly, genuinely concerned about their safety. So another important part of our work was really starting at those early stages of the crisis to advocate for humanitarian assistance that would reach all Afghans, including those who are most often sidelined, like women, like adolescent girls, like children. Because we knew that food insecurity would be a great risk, gender-based violence such as child marriage and forced marriage and sexual assault was already being reported. Women's health was certainly suffering already, even in early stages, because the Taliban immediately imposed rules that women couldn't travel without a male guardian, or that only female doctors could treat female patients. And so there were a lot of humanitarian risks even in Afghanistan for those staying. And so it was very much part of our job, and it still is, to advocate for policies and programs and solutions that really meet those needs.
What we're seeing on the ground is that women are still being harassed in the street by Taliban forces. There are report after report of women and girls being kidnapped and forced into marriages to Taliban soldiers or put into sexual servitude, children being groomed for marriage, public floggings for minor offenses.
Well, one thing was the fact that Amin really needed to be anonymous to be able to share his story. But other than that, it's a story that mostly takes place in the past. So it was, how do you make the past come back alive? And here animation was really a good tool to kind of show his childhood home, show Afghanistan in the 80s, Moscow in the 90s. But also because it's really a story about memory and trauma. And with the animation, it really enabled us to, show the inside of Amin, show his emotions. So when he starts to talk about traumatic events or things that's really difficult for him to talk about, we could dive into these kind of more expressive and surreal reenactments that will kind of show his emotions and feelings. But I think also, because it's animation, it becomes more universal because it's not a person in his flesh, but you have this kind of animated filter that kind of makes his story not just his own, but it kind of represents, all the refugees. And also, I think, speaking for myself, we're exposed to so many of these kind of stories all the time in the media. And I tend to block things out because I can't take everything in. If I take everything in, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning because it's so depressing. But the fact that it's not a person in his flesh, but it's animation, and because we all grew up with animation as something we look at when we're kids, I think there's a more kind of clear path to the heart. And you start to listen more. You start to listen to what's being said and take it in. And that was my experiences before with the first animated documentaries I saw. I saw one called Balls of Bashir, which is about a genocide in Lebanon. And I watched that and I sat through it and listened to everything because it was animation. I could do that and I could take everything in and kind of. So I think somehow the animation helps ease up really tough subjects, and also creates this sense of universality to the story.
It's been really hard to feel a sense of hope for Afghan women and girls recently, particularly in the last few months. I mean, we've seen the Taliban show over and over again that their views on women's rights and gender equality haven't changed. And most recently, we've seen them renege on a decision that would allow girls to return to school, which really dashed the hopes of girls to receive a formal education. Just a month or two ago, we were still getting reports that women brave enough to actually protest Taliban restrictions on the streets were being arrested and held indefinitely, and hearing really difficult accounts of brutal treatment, including sexual violence while they were being held. Women's mobility is still restricted by requirements that they have to have a male guardian, or just because they're being harassed on the street for being out in public. They haven't been able to return fully to work, so economic independence and economic security is a big challenge for them. So what we're advocating for with the U.S. government and more broadly is really to, first and foremost, listen to Afghan women. They have so often been excluded from peacekeeping discussions, from diplomatic conversations, from having a seat at the table when decisions are being made. And so we're advocating for to ensure that women's rights are a priority in diplomatic negotiations with the Taliban, if not an actual precursor to some of those discussions. We want to ensure that Afghan women themselves are part of the negotiations and that their voices are not excluded, but are actually heard. One big area of our advocacy right now is to keep pushing for pathways for Afghan women and girls and others who are at risk to seek safety. And I think this was a really critical part of the film, that you see that there's so much desperation to leave that often you end up in incredibly dangerous circumstances that just to get across the border or just to get to safety, it shouldn't be that hard. And so we're really advocating with the government to expand visa and resettlement options and loosen some of the requirements that are needed to be able to get lawful entry into or out of Afghanistan and to resettle elsewhere. And finally, we're monitoring the human rights situation, and we're encouraging governments and humanitarian partners to really center this, that monitoring human rights, including women's rights, and supporting women's human rights defenders on the ground is critically important to how we approach our relationships in Afghanistan right now. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us, and certainly there's a lot of advocacy to be done. But those are some of our key priorities.
Just wanted to jump in and add, specifically talking about the LGBTQ community in Afghanistan. The situation there is also incredibly complex. After college, I went and worked and lived in Afghanistan, and I got to see kind of the sometimes underground, sometimes less underground scene and community for the community there. And I think it's something that we have to, as an international community, have to think about. The past 20 years, there was a lot of international presence. There was the United Nations, there was the EU, there was everyone and all the different NGOs working there. And there were pockets for LGBTQ Afghans to come out, to learn, to meet people. And now that's been taken away incredibly quickly overnight. And the options that people face there are incredibly stark, because it means either outing yourself to your family, because a lot of times when you go to an embassy and try to claim some kind of, or ask for some kind of humanitarian protection, they'll want documentation, they'll interview your neighbors, they'll interview, etc. That's not an option. And also specifically, I think this was raised in the screening of Flea that I was able to go to, with a representative from Immigration Equality. He said that, Amin's story is possible because he was a cis man, he was a cis gay man, and he was able to move and with all the privileges of being a man in a traditional Islamic society without needing a chaperone, etc. Women or queer women, trans people don't have that option. And so we've been in touch with different groups, as a part of my efforts within the Afghan diaspora to kind of make sure that we get the resources that we need to those people. But it's another compounding factor is that a lot of the neighboring countries, all of the neighboring countries aren't friendly to LGBTQ communities. And so the only option is to make an incredibly dangerous, long journey, like Amin did, to Europe or other places where there are more accepting government schemes for LGBTQ people. But right now that access is really limited. And so in line with what Gayatri said, it needs to be a precursor to any kind of negotiation with the Taliban. We thought that with the Biden administration that, the smart people, the compassionate people would be back in the White House and be able to, and that we as advocates and volunteers and others would be able to start really working in earnest to rebuild the refugee resettlement program and to once again continue welcoming people who are seeking safety. For whatever reason, that hasn't happened yet, and it's taken a lot longer than it should. But I do want to zoom out. This is not just the United States. Jonas is in Europe. We're seeing the same happening there, and we're seeing more clearly than ever the disparate treatment of certain populations of refugees. We see in Germany Afghans being expelled and deported to make room for Ukrainian refugees. And so I think it's just we've come out of these 2 years of COVID and economic crisis, and I think people automatically go back to kind of a mentality of if you get a piece of the pie, then that means I don't get any. And we really need to challenge that thinking and say, the best option forward is for all of us to work on this together. And, at the border, yes, those themes of multiple identities come up over and over and over again. When we first saw caravans of people leaving incredible violence in Central America, the people at the very front of the caravan were trans women who presented themselves at the border and said, we need safety. There's only so many ways that I can, even though I'm a communicator, there's only so many ways that I can say, you should care about other human beings, you should care about their safety, and you should care, everyone has the fundamental right to be safe and to seek safety. But I guess that's the challenge of our day.
We see the ones that are reported in the news, and we're concerned about those. But we're also concerned about the ones that are not reported on as much. The crises in South Sudan or in Ethiopia, or the ongoing concerns of people who have fled Myanmar. There's so much to work through, and I think what we try to center is that those lived experiences are incredibly important to the advocacy work that we do, to the communications work that we do. And that's why films like Flee are so critically important to that space, because it illustrates the human side of what a refugee is, what seeking asylum looks like, what the challenges and struggles are, not just, for personal safety, but your growth, your development. And I think Amin's story was just such a beautiful example of how people are impacted in the long run by some of these crises that they live through. So, humanizing the experiences is so important to this work. And I think that, we can translate that into better policies, better practices, better programs. And that's our ultimate goal. I mean, ultimate goal is to not have crises to begin with, but in terms of how we respond to that, the ultimate goal is to make sure that we're meeting the needs, so that we're not losing generations of people to crises.
I'm in touch with him all the time. We've been in touch today. So he's doing well. I don't know if I'm going to spoil anything now if people haven't seen the film, but he's in the house to end up in the end of the film with his husband, and he's found a home. He's found a place where he feels like he belongs, that he really struggled to find for a very long time. But I think, of course, with the experiences he's had, that's always going to loom inside of him, that this can be taken away from me, and there's always this fear is going to be there forever. But right now, he feels safe here for the most part. So he's well, and he's really happy. He's really proud that the film has gone out and it's reached so many people. And for him growing up, he didn't have a lot of stories where he felt represented. There's so many refugee stories, but often they're just portrayed by being just refugees. So for him to have a nuanced story out there where he's not just defined by being a refugee, but he's defined by being, first of all, a human being, and then he's also a house owner, and he's gay, and he's a cat lover, and he's a brilliant academic. He's all these things, and not just defined by being a refugee. And I think for him to be able to give his story to the world and to give his story to people who have similar experiences, so they have something where they feel seen, is very meaningful to him. So he's doing very well, and it's of course overwhelming, but he has kept his anonymity. So for him to see this from afar has been really a joy to see that people feel seen, and that people also understand the refugee narrative in another way. So it's been a tough but very meaningful experience for both of us to make this film. It's really about creating a room where he's able to share and I just listen. I think that's really what's needed. It's for a lot of listening. And then, of course, questions pop up when you listen. When you're really interested in what's being said and you listen, then naturally there's a conversation going on. So it felt more like a conversation than me doing, an interview. It didn't feel like an interview. It felt like we're having a conversation, and he's opening up this black box I mentioned in the beginning, and slowly things revealed, and naturally questions would pop up because I was listening. And when you listen, you start to understand things and you become curious, and then you ask questions naturally. So I didn't have like a plan of where we're going. I just tried to follow what was coming out. And I think, to really understand the healing powers of sharing and listening. And I think that's the fact that we have so many refugees around the world, and they all have complex individual stories, and they all need, someone to listen to them. And I think that's where our system kind of break, because we don't have the capacity to listen to everyone. We just kind of say, okay, and we start to identify that, okay, but now we have this big group of refugees coming and we can't control them. But really, we just need to kind of, make room for people to be themselves and be able to share and listen. That's the first step. And then, of course, there's a lot of issues we need to take care of. But first of all, we just need to, I really admire what Bilal and Gayatri are doing, but what I do for work is telling stories, and a lot of storytelling comes from just to listen to what people have to say.
The biggest challenge has been the fundamental one, that it seems very clear that the Biden administration sees this issue of people seeking safety as a political one, as a liability instead of an opportunity and a strength and a way for the administration to show its values. I think, I don't know why. I don't know why. And it seems to be coming at the very highest levels of this administration, whether that's President Biden himself or his closest advisors. They've really just kind of continued or really bought into the belief that the American public isn't as welcoming as I see, daily that they are. I've been to border shelters in Arizona and San Diego, and for the past 4 or 5 years now, before even at WRC, I was working with these coalitions of people who are just average Americans, native born white Americans who feel compelled to go out there. And when they hear news of refugees showing up, they said, okay, do they need jackets? Do they need food? Do the kids need toys and clean clothes? And they're doing it. And I wish that the Biden administration could see that, because I think it would change their mind.
What's interesting about the Afghanistan situation is that there is public support for supporting Afghans who want to leave. There was a swell of support even in the early stages to support our allies and the people who worked with the military in Afghanistan or worked with American organizations, and that's still there. And so I think having that support there as a basis helps us advocate to the administration that more needs to be done. And we've seen, even with the Ukraine example, of what's possible when the world cares about a humanitarian crisis. They have the resources, they have the political will, they have the interest to respond appropriately. And I think that's how we want to see the U.S. government step up and other governments step up. But within that, not to lose sight of those like women and girls and people with disabilities, or the LGBT community, or ethnic minorities, or even third country nationals who are in those countries and facing multiple types of discrimination. We can't let those groups be sidelined or ignored. We need to make sure that our responses meet all of those nuances, or else we risk leaving people behind.
I did have a quite extraordinary grandmother. She's not here anymore. But it kind of, to me, she was French. She was, her and my grandfather lived in Paris. But I knew that there was another story to it. She spoke German. And there was this story that, she was born a refugee. My great-grandparents fled Russia from the pogroms. They were Jewish and fled as Amin, by boat through the Baltic Sea, and ended up here in Copenhagen, just at a central station that's like 10 miles that way from not even 3 miles that way from where I live. And my grandmother was born at a hotel right there. And they applied for asylum, but didn't get it. So they moved on and moved to Germany and to Berlin, which wasn't the best place to be at the time. So my grandmother grew up in Berlin and having to stand up in school every day with a yellow star on her chest, while all the other kids had to point at her and call her Jew. And then she had to flee again. So all of her childhood and her youth, she was a refugee as well. And this, in the part of the process of making flee, also changed my perspective of, often refugees is seen, at least, here in Denmark, as someone who comes from the outside. But, this was someone very close. And we also see it now with how people see it differently when it's Ukrainians, because it's a part of Europe. And people say, okay, but if it can happen there, then it can happen here as well. And they think, okay, but then we need to open our borders. We need to open our homes and our hearts for these Ukrainian refugees. And I really hope that it's this kind of change how we perceive refugees in general, whether from Ukraine or Afghanistan or Myanmar, or wherever in the world people are in need for a place to go. So yeah, back to my grandmother. I'm not going to make a film about her. I think I've done what I can about the refugee narrative for now, and I think to me it's just to just get a human face to these stories. And it's just lovely to hear Bilal talk about how he also had these posters on his wall, of George Michael and Madonna, because it's all about creating connections. We need to feel this connectivity, that we're how alike we are, and that whether you're from Afghanistan or Denmark or the US, that we're all connected. It can be by music, it can be by loving Jean-Claude Van Damme or George Michael, or something else. We all have hope and dreams for the future that we want to strive for. And as human beings, they're quite the same. So just through stories, that's what I'm trying to do, to create this kind of sense of connectivity and an experience of being in the same boat.
I'll start with the girls' education question. I mean, it's almost seen as a litmus test for whether the Taliban has changed or not, whether they're going to allow girls to go to school. And it's frustrating because to think that a government has the right to say whether you're allowed or not allowed to get an education is mind-boggling. But so be it. In Afghanistan, the Taliban promised that girls would be able to go to school. They had not been going to school from August 15th onwards. Boys had started going back to school. And there was a date maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago where they were told, okay, girls would be able to go back to school. Schools would be sex segregated. Only female teachers could teach female students. And there were certainly some questions around whether the girls' curriculum would be the same as the boys. Perhaps the girls would be getting more religious instruction than the boys. Unfortunately, that date came and went, and girls were actually turned away from schools, and they were not allowed to resume their education. And so, the reason purportedly was that their head coverings and their dress code was not up to the Taliban standards. So it's excuse and just these concepts of what girls and women should be that are messing with so many issues in Afghan women and girls' lives right now. And I think Afghan girls in particular are facing the brunt, particularly when it comes to education and their future prospects. So our advocacy is really to make sure that this remains a very central point in diplomatic discussions and negotiations, but that we're also looking at the bigger picture. It's not that the Taliban's going to allow girls to go to school and then everything's okay. It's a sign, it's a signal of returning a bit to normalcy. But the bigger picture is that we need to push for gender equality and for women's rights and women's voices and girls' rights and girls' voices in society there. And right now, it's even when women are able to speak up, it's very often shut down quickly. And then in terms of children more broadly, I think they're facing the brunt of the food insecurity. There were horrific stories about girls being sold into child marriages to be able to have food for the family. Really difficult, heart-wrenching decisions that parents have to make about which child to feed if they can only feed one, if at all. And so, the broader food insecurity, the broader economic insecurity situation is having a really deep impact on children physically. I can only imagine what it is for them emotionally and psychologically. So it's very much at the center of our advocacy work. In terms of what's next, I mean, advocacy is an ongoing body of work. We'll continually be pushing for governments and donors and actors to be doing better. But I think what's centered in my mind is that Afghan women, particularly the ones who are protesting in the streets and demanding respect for their rights, are amongst the bravest people that I've ever known. And to the degree that we can continue lifting their voices or helping them amplify their voices, supporting their work on the ground, giving them or opening up pathways for their voices to be heard, that's what I intend to keep doing, I hope, and invite others to join me in that work. So thank you all. Thank you, Jonas, for having Amin have that voice and really illustrate his story.
I want to circle back to what you asked me in the beginning about what inspires me. Growing up, I never thought that I would see a film, an Oscar-nominated film at that, about a gay Afghan. I didn't think that I would even be alive to make it this far. And so the fact that we've come that far, and the fact that Amin was able to share his story, and the fact that at the end of the day, the systems worked eventually for Amin and for me, that's inspiring. I say that asylum saved my life twice, because when I was a little kid fleeing the war, it saved my life. And then, if we hadn't left Afghanistan and I grew up as a gay person there, I wouldn't be alive. And so the fact that despite everything, sometimes, our systems work, and that we as societies are in so many ways moving towards progress, that's inspiring. And so I thank you, Jonas, for making this film, and thank you, Amin. Please thank Amin for me. And I think I told you at the screening that, just let him know he has a friend here that loves cats, that it also, and so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. That this makes the whole thing worth it. We spent a long time making this film, and just to hear that you feel seen, it just means everything. So thank you for that. And for me, it's just to keep pushing and get the story out as widely as possible, to create these connections, and people see that he's first of all a human being. All these refugees at our borders are first of all human beings that we need to relate to as fellow human beings. So thank you for that, and thank you for having me tonight.